In the heart of an old, forgotten town, nestled deep within the shadowed embrace of an overgrown estate, stood a mansion that time had long since forsaken. It was here that a young man, an urban explorer with a penchant for the past, ventured inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick, dusty air. The grand halls were silent, filled with the ghosts of forgotten memories and draped in cobwebs that shimmered like silver threads. As he navigated through decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper, he found himself drawn to a single object hanging precariously on a damp, crumbling wall, a painting. It depicted a woman of ethereal beauty, her features soft and sorrowful, but it was the frame that first caught his eye, a once ornate wooden border, now rotted and splintered with age. Yet, despite its decay, the portrait itself seemed eerily preserved. The most unsettling feature, however, were the eyes. Painted with an almost lifelike precision, they seemed to hold a flicker of consciousness, a depth that felt unnervingly real. As he stood there, captivated, he could have sworn he saw them move, a subtle shift in their gaze that seemed to follow his every step. He dismissed it at first, a trick of the light, a figment of his overactive imagination fueled by the mansion's oppressive atmosphere. The decaying grandeur and the profound silence were enough to make anyone see things that weren't there. He took a few photos, documented his find, and left the mansion as dusk began to bleed across the sky. The image of the painting seared into his mind. That night, sleep offered little respite. He found himself dreaming of the mansion, of the long, dark corridors, and of the woman in the portrait. He dreamt of her eyes, which in his slumber were no longer static pools of paint, but living, breathing orbs that watched him with an intense, pleading stare. When he awoke, the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold weight in the pit of his stomach. He returned to the mansion the next day, compelled by an inexplicable urge to see the painting again. As he stood before it, the feeling was stronger than ever. The eyes were fixed on him, their painted gaze no longer a mere illusion, but a tangible, predatory focus. He moved to the left, and the pupils seemed to drift, tracking him. He moved to the right, and they followed, their silent observation sending a shiver down his spine. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet madness. Each night, his visits to the mansion grew longer, his obsession with the painting deepening. The initial fear began to morph into a strange, morbid curiosity. Soon, the visual disturbances were joined by auditory ones. Faint whispers began to snake through the silent halls, so soft at first that he thought it was just the wind whistling through the broken window panes. But the sounds grew clearer, coalescing into the voice of a woman, a voice laced with a timeless sorrow and a desperate longing. It was her voice, the woman from the painting. She whispered her name, a name that the wind seemed to carry and then snatch away. She spoke of her life, of being a lady of the house, of a love betrayed, and of a dark ritual that had trapped her soul within the canvas and oil. Her voice was a siren's call, a delicate, haunting melody of despair that wrapped around his heart, begging him and him alone to free her from her eternal prison. She promised him riches, knowledge, anything his heart desired, if only he would release her from the gilded wooden frame. The young man was torn. Part of him, the rational part, screamed that this was a hallucination, a psychological break brought on by the isolation and the eerie environment. He was a man of logic, of the tangible world, and ghosts and cursed paintings belonged in fiction, not reality. Yet the other part of him, the part that had been seduced by the mystery and the sorrow in her voice, felt a profound empathy for her plight. The whispers grew more insistent, more desperate, her pleas echoing not just in the mansion, but in his own mind, even when he was miles away. The line between his world and hers was blurring, her painted reality seeping into his own. He could no longer distinguish the sound of the wind from the sound of her weeping. The woman in the painting was no longer just a subject of a forgotten artist. She was a presence, a conscious entity whose suffering had become his own. He knew he couldn't leave her there. He had to do something. He decided he would take the painting down, break the curse, and set her free. He didn't know how, but he felt an overwhelming conviction that removing it from its place of power was the first step. With his resolve hardened, he returned to the mansion one last time as a storm raged outside, the thunder rattling the old house to its very foundations. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark, epileptic bursts. He approached the painting, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and determination coursing through his veins. Her whispers were frantic now, a cacophony of promises and warnings. As he reached out, his fingers brushing against the decayed edge of the wooden frame, a sudden, deafening silence fell over the room. The whispers stopped, the wind died down. In the oppressive stillness, the eyes in the portrait snapped wide open, no longer painted but horrifyingly real, filled with a malevolent, triumphant gleam. Before he could recoil, before he could even scream, a hand pale cold, and unnaturally long shot out from the surface of the painting. It wasn't a painted hand. It was flesh and bone, its fingers like talons, gripping his wrist with inhuman strength. He was powerless against its pull. The world around him dissolved into a vortex of swirling colors, the textures of oil, and canvas scraping against his skin as he was dragged, screaming, into the two-dimensional prison. The next morning, the sun rose, casting gentle rays of light through the grimy windows of the abandoned mansion. The storm had passed. Inside, everything was as it should be. The painting of the beautiful, sorrowful woman hung on the wall, untouched, its wooden frame decayed and ancient. But something was different. Something had changed. Deep within the portrait, a new pair of eyes stared out from the painted face of the woman eyes, filled with a fresh, familiar terror. The eyes of the young man who had dared to answer her call, now trapped, now part of the art. His silent scream forever locked behind a veneer of oil and varnish.